This reading series is devoted to bringing back our own alumni who have recently published books. We're very happy to welcome first Siobhan Adcock, who is the author of The Barter, a ghost story about motherhood and marriage. Her fiction has appeared in Tri-Quarterly, the Massachusetts Review, and I love this one, Elsewhere. She's also written a great deal on the blog for Huffington Post, Epicurious, XO Jane, Jet Setter, and other sites. And other sites apparently is not a magazine. She's currently the digital editorial director. It's come to that, right? She's the digital editorial director for All You, which is run by Time Inc. Not on the poster, she's the author of 30 Things Everyone Should Know How to Do Before 30. Those were the days. Those were the days. And also Hipster Haiku. Siobhan is a very funny person, kind to her friends, and I would say there's a great generosity of heart as well as wit in her fiction. Please welcome Siobhan Adcock.
The pages that I'm going to read are from The Barter, which is my first novel. As Stephanie said, it's about two women who live in Texas, the same part of Texas, German immigrants settled hill country outside of Austin, but they live in two different time periods. One storyline is a contemporary storyline, and the other one starts in 1902. Both of the main characters are women who are dealing with the identity conflicts that arise out of marriage and motherhood, and there's a ghost thrown in. This scene that I'm going to read is from one of the sections that are the historical storylines. So what you would need to know about sort of the background is Rebecca, the main character, one of the two main characters, has been cruel to her husband, John, and she's caused some damage to her marriage. She's had a baby, so she's finding her way as a new mother. She has, with her marriage, moved from a kind of small frontier town to a small struggling farm where she found herself really kind of unprepared for the level and the kind of work that was expected of her there, and also kind of the physical labor and also the kind of like the management labor. She manages a small staff of hired farm workers for the first time in her life. So in every theater of her life, she's kind of renegotiating and finding her power and trying to decide what that is and how she's going to best use it. And that's where this scene picks up. A good German farmer was a man who planned for and overcame the everyday catastrophes of farm life, of which there are as many as there are days in the week. Broken wagon wheels or tools, recalcitrant or wounded animals, not enough rain, too much rain, early frosts, too much heat, yields that were low, or what was often just as bad, too high to bring in without hiring extra help. The farms in German Texas had an old reputation for being run by good farmers. Ever since the German folk had first begun arriving in the hill country many years before the Civil War, their farms were known to be the neatest, the best equipped, the best run. Besides their competence in the field, it was often declared that German farmhouses, too, had the brightest gardens, the sweetest water, the cleanest sheets. German farmers were said to have a gift for high yields. It was not unheard of in their county to see melons planted neatly among the corn rows, as equidistant between the corn stalks as if the farmer had planted them with a yardstick. An accident, severe enough to delay the business of the farm, was a source of frustration and embarrassment for a good farmer's family. Yet the day came on the Hirschfelder's place when the exhaustion and grind of the season, along with the heavy burdens that John carried mostly on his own, resulted in their inevitable catastrophe. One warm early November day after dinner time, while Matthew was napping in his crib in the shady cool of the front parlor, Dusanna and Rebecca were in the kitchen finishing what they thought might be the final batch of pickled green beans. The fall crop had turned out even better than the spring beans, sweet and tender and straight, and Rebecca was feeling a little sorry to be packing the last of them in jars. She had been smelling smoke for some time without consciously deciding that it was a different kind of smoke than the one her modern, grouchy kitchen stove tended to put off when they used twists of hay for tinder, as they sometimes did. She looked up at Dusanna, drawing water from the reservoir on the stove, and realized that the girl's eyes were slightly red, and that the sting in her own mouth wasn't of vinegar but of smoke, and the light filtering through the kitchen had a golden gray cast. Feeling Rebecca's eyes on her, Desana glanced toward the table, and something in Rebecca's expression made her hands still, stop. Pushing up from the table, Rebecca said to Desana in a low voice, "Go to the baby. Go now." Desana dropped the metal cup she held, still staring at Rebecca, whose face seemed, even to herself, strange and frozen, as if she'd looked at Medusa. "What?" Desana whispered. Then they heard the first screams from the yard. "Go now," Rebecca ordered, rising and finding herself on the other side of the kitchen doorway before she even felt herself move. She scanned the green-gold perimeter lines of the fields for the men and saw John and the Heinrich brothers running for the barn, and curling around the side of the barn like a gloved, suggestive finger, a pale gray plume of smoke, white and hot. Fire, the barn. Rebecca raced across the kitchen garden and past the pump toward the outbuildings. No way of knowing how much of the barn would be destroyed, how many of their tools, how much of their seed, their milking implements. She thanked God from her heart that most of the animals were out in the pasture, although she knew there was a clique of old fat sheep that sometimes liked to make a nest for themselves in the shady area just inside the barn door. The screams continued, but she knew now they were not human, and no sheep could make a sound like that, piercingly high, loud enough to set her eardrums buzzing. She ran. Barn fires weren't exactly unusual in that hot, dry country, of course. No one kept any quantity of hay in a wooden barn in summer. Some of the more prosperous farmers erected stone barns as soon as they could afford the materials and the time. One Como County family had been forced to watch a fire in their barn spread across their fields and their yard and eventually set their house ablaze. They had moved to San Antonio, where the wife had family that could take some of their children in. They had nothing to put in the wagon, nothing to take away from the stage where their lives, the work of their hands, had come to ruin. Everything they owned had been eaten alive. Rebecca rounded the corner of the barn, coming onto the wagon path that led from the barnyard back to the farmhouse drive, and from there out to the farm-to-market road. There in the wagon path, she skidded to a halt and dropped to her hands and knees. Pledge, the dray mare, an animal whose leaden, dappled coat usually put Rebecca in mind of a winter field in bleakest January, typically spent her days harnessed to the spring wagon the men used to drive into town and to move light tools and equipment from the sheds to the barn or the fields. Pledge had spent a long, sweaty youth tied to a series of cultivators, gang plows, and threshers, and had earned a little ease in her middle age. Her left forehoof was also prone to splits and infection, although she was otherwise a strong old girl, not in the least dainty, if a bit on the haughty side for a workhorse. Rebecca didn't know their farm horses as well as she knew the cows. The horses were usually out in the fields with the men. But Pledge she knew by name because by now she was more or less a fixture around the barnyard, and because she would, if she felt like it, respond to her name if it were called from not too far beyond the ridge that separated the barnyard from the acreage. From where Rebecca worked in the house or the garden, she had often heard this horse's name called with humor, with mock longing, with affection. The wagon Pledge was harnessed to was in flames. With the heat and the lick of the fire at her back, the horse was in a panic, charging and bucking through the barnyard, tearing her head side to side, panting, eyes rolling. Her hindquarters had been badly singed, and her tail was smoldering. Smoke and the smell of blood and the horse's fear roiled through the air. The animal had somehow ripped a gash open across her breast. A pitchfork and a broken backhoe lay strewn across the hard dirt, along with the smashed pieces of the barn animal's wooden barrel trough, surrounded by an irregular pattern of darkened dust where the water inside the barrel had disappeared into the earth. Rebecca forced herself to her feet as the men appeared atop the ridge, and Pledge ran for the fence, trailing a racketing terror of flames and anguish. John and the Heinrichs didn't pause until they reached the barnyard, but they were forced to back away as Pledge reared up and threw herself against the gate that led to the empty cow pen. Impossible to think of catching her reins, impossible to think of getting close enough to unhitch the harness. "John," Rebecca shouted. She felt tears streaming down her face and sensed by the hitch of her breath that she was either sobbing or choking on the smoke. She advanced toward her husband, who caught her shoulders. "Rebecca, I have to get her past the fence. If she runs into the fields, she'll trail fire into the..." He released her and shouted to Paul Heinrich, the younger of the two brothers, "Get the horse blankets from the barn, all of them." To Rebecca, he said grimly, "We need the blankets wet. We can try throwing them over the wagon to smother the fire or over Pledge's head to calm her long enough to set her free. God help her, and the trough is destroyed. The only water's at the pump." John paused. "Can you help me?" How? How? We don't have time to get the water from the pump. We have to take the blankets there and soak them, then get them back across the yard. Help Paul, direct him. Where will you be? I have to try to drive her past the fence, and I have to try to unhitch her somehow. Oh God, John, be careful, please, please. His face was terrible in that moment. She saw it all across his eyes and his mouth, as if the truth were written there. An understanding of how he wanted to feel toward her had intruded on his determination to feel nothing toward her, and it had only gouged the gulf between them deeper. I will. The younger Heinrich emerged from the smoke-filled barn, staggering under a heavy armload of horse blankets, and Rebecca raced up the slope toward the house to prime the pump. She was working the pump handle so hard her arm felt as if it would fly off, when Paul caught up to her and dumped the load of blankets on the dirt at her feet. She glanced quickly back at the inscrutable windows of her house and then back to the pump, where mercifully the water had begun to flow. Paul, she saw with some surprise, was weeping, standing still and wringing his hands. With the stout toe of her laced leather boot, Rebecca kicked one of the horse blankets beneath the stream of water from the pump. She glared at the wretched farm boy. "My God, what is the matter with you?" she said. "We must be quick and sharp and smart now, not falling to pieces. We could still save the mare." Paul was scarcely older than Desana. "I should have shot her in the head when we came back from town, better than lead her to this state," he wept. John and Martin and Paul had been down to the depot in the grain elevator that morning, Rebecca recalled. They'd taken pledge from a wagon and returned just before dinner. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. "I had a smoke in the barnyard, ma'am, before I went out to the fields after dinner." "You mean you think your cigarette started this?" Rebecca wiped her eyes with her sleeve impatiently. "There was some straw in the wagon, ma'am. I was supposed to sweep it out, and I didn't, and I had my cigarette and tossed it aside as I went out because they were calling for me and they couldn't wait. And I forgot all about pledge. I forgot." Paul's eyes streamed. The air in the yard was gray, as if a layer of fog had settled over them. Rebecca thought with dismay of the stink that would pervade the house, the hours of washing of drapes and curtains and bedclothes that faced her, and of Pledge, poor Pledge, who must have stood in the barnyard, attached to a smoldering wooden fire trap for some time before the pain started, before realizing the danger she was in. "Take this down. Bartensey, can you manage more? Then take these," she snapped, pointing at the sodden heap at her feet and working the pump handle with a rage that clarified her thoughts and hardened her heart. The cries of the poor horse provoked a harsh sob from Rebecca's own throat as she watched the Heinrich boy dragging the soaked horse blankets down the dust through the slope. She finished dousing the last of them and then followed behind Paul as quickly as she could manage, with the corners of 2 blankets clutched in each fist, pulling with all her might against the weight of the water and the flannel and the dirt that quickly caked on the underside of her burden. When she returned around the corner of the barn onto the wagon path, she saw immediately that John and Martin had managed to chase Pledge into the cow pen, but the horse's suffering, which had seemed only minutes earlier as if it could hardly have been worse, was amplified unbearably within the fenced-in space. Pledge galloped from one end of the enclosure to the other, screaming and thrashing, bleeding from fresh wounds on her neck and her right foreleg, now rearing up and smashing one powerful hoof on a fence post, now dashing her own head against the gate in her frenzy. The wagon was charred and smoldering, the wagons turning and lurching, and chunks, large and small, of still fiery wood littered the dirt. John knelt inside the cow pen, breathing hard, recovering from his last attempt to corner the horse, his expression resolute and pained. Martin and Paul were straining to heap the wet horse blankets over the top rail of the cow pen fence. As Rebecca approached, Martin climbed swiftly over the fence and joined John inside, but both men had to scatter as the horse made another mad charge in their direction. Paul turned, and seeing the mistress of the house dragging 2 horse blankets that weighed almost as much as she did, moved to help her, shouting, "John and Martin are going to corner her. John said for you to go get the gun." This last was yelled into her face as he reached her side. Rebecca stared. "Surely not yet. Can't we save her?" Paul shot her a grim look. "But I can't leave him here," she almost said. But the boy had turned already, taking the horse flannels from her as he did so, and with a holler of effort, throwing them atop the other blankets piled along the cow pen fence, which bowed under the weight. John had already seized one, and Martin followed suit. Now the horse's strength had begun to flag, or perhaps she understood that within her fiery prison help was finally at hand, and Pledge staggered. She took a labored step toward the center of the cow pen, and Rebecca watched as one of the horse's knees buckled and gave. The proud animal sank, whinnying weakly like a foal, and the blackened and blazing oven behind her reared up, tipping forward on its front axle. There came a tremendous crack as the axle split. "Now," John bellowed, and the men charged forward, looking almost like a ragged trio of bullfighters, hauling the soaked horse blankets between them. John threw his blanket over Pledge's head and neck and held her fast, although she fought to regain her feet when Paul slapped a wet flannel over her burned hindquarters. Meanwhile, Martin worked to smother the fire in the wagon, staggering back and forth between the fence and the center of the cow pen. Instead of running for the house, Rebecca climbed the fence. Pledge suddenly threw her head back and screamed again, although there was less terror than pain in the sound. John clung to the horse's neck and pulled her to him with all his strength, shouting to her, "Pledge, calm, girl, be still, still, girl." Still, her body surged forward, toward Rebecca, almost as if the animal sensed her there and wanted to warn her or expel her or perhaps urge her to come closer. Caught by a corner of the wagon, as it lurched behind the horse's weight, Martin fell to his hands and knees and knocked Paul down as he went. How John managed to keep from being kicked was a miracle and a mystery to his wife. "Steady, Pledge, steady," John said firmly. Rebecca dropped to the ground inside the fence and pulled a sodden flannel over the dirt, hauling it toward Martin, who was on his feet again and didn't spare her a glance. The smoke was everywhere, thick and stinking and dry. The smell of charred horseflesh and the iron tang of blood curdled in her nostrils. She saw with some admiration that the plan had worked, that while John restrained the horse, the Heinrichs had mostly succeeded in smothering the fire. Martin and Paul smacked fearsomely with the blankets, driving down the flames. Rebecca squinted through the haze at the remains of the horse's harness. One of the long wooden shafts that followed the horse's flanks all the way back to the wagon had broken off at the coupling, but the leather traces underneath had remained in one piece, unburnable and unbreakable. The check lines that ran along Pledge's back could not be seen, buried as they were beneath the damp horse blankets on her rear quarters. Rebecca didn't like to think that they might have burned into the horse's flesh, but she supposed it was possible and likely. Pledge was breathing heavily. John said, in a voice that was low but commanding, "Martin, come and take her. I'm going to cut her loose." Martin obeyed immediately, stepping around Rebecca and wrapping his arms tenderly around the horse's neck. Her fight was gone. At Martin's touch, she stretched her neck forward along the ground and groaned. Martin, kneeling beside her, groaned in sympathy. "Poor girl. Poor old girl," he murmured. "Ah, you poor sweet girl." At this, Rebecca could not help but feel her heart lurch as if a powerful hand had pressed it. She wiped her sleeve across her eyes, and when she saw again, John was watching her across the ruined horse's back. The horse, the wagon, the harness itself, all these things cost money, and money was dear to them, would always be. A stupid accident like this one, preventable and painful, was like a deep bite through skin and tissue all the way to bone that might never really heal properly. They had hard times ahead, that much they'd already known, but the real sorrow was that for some reason they'd both long forgotten they couldn't face anything down together, because they weren't together. They could have been. His knife was out. She met his gaze steadily. "Go on," she said. "Go ahead." John pulled on his gloves and knelt behind the horse and set to work. Thank you.
John Lonsinger is the author of the gorgeous collection Whelm, which is winner of the 2012 Idaho Prize in Poetry, published by Lost Horse Press. And Don also has published 2 chapbooks, The Linoleum Crop, which is winner of the 2007 Jean Duval Editions Chapbook Contest, and The Nested Object from Dancing Girl Press, 2009. Her work has appeared in American Poetry Review, Colorado Review, Black Warrior Review, Crazy Horse, Guernica, Columbia Poetry Review, New Orleans Review, Cincinnati Review, Poetry East, the Massachusetts Review, Subtropics, and the famous Elsewhere. She's currently Assistant Professor of Creative Writing and Literature at Muhlenberg College, and she does the most extraordinary things with language, some of the most extraordinary things with language I've ever read on the page. So she's one of my favorite poets, Dawn Lonsinger.
Thank you so much, Alice, for that very sweet introduction. This first poem I just would preface with saying the woman who shows up in the poem who dislikes football is W.S. Merwin's mother, a story he told me. Forage. Before barbed wire, it was easy to walk away from cruelty and hunger, to move like wind over the nearly uninhabited earth, bursting with fruit, the wheezing of deer, mushrooms expanding inside of wet nights. Trout gliding knives downstream but cutting nothing, to the next best thing. Forage and forget. There is nothing primal about hoarding, about the anonymity of faces in houses, about the stress of holding on to clout, to brandishing. Now, every prostitute knows how to simulate a prostitute, make idiots in motel darkness. Nobody speaks of the wildness of farmers. Someone somewhere eating deep-fried songbird, and Jenny talking to the stuffed parrot hanging in her cage, winding the alarm clock she keeps in a basket because she does not own a watch, and birds twitter in the skull of her hedge. Because the children and their little feet running over every blade are terrifying, though at least one of those children feels suffocated by the sadism of normalcy, knocks on her door to be near the beauty of foible, to see her hands hold chocolate bars like hymn books, to begin to imagine that the codifiers will not win the compliment of haunting by way of the violence of conclusion. His mother gasps when the football players on the television fall down. Because she has known great loss, it does not make sense to replicate it, even playfully. She gasps as humans do when witnessing everyday obliteration, or when hurtling their bones into one another. During sex or conflict, swoon or wince, inescapable cry at the origin of the storied world, prior to money, but not desire and water and tongues, carrying through with it inescapable heart and pubis of darkness. Wherever you touch the story, it is not nice. Our journey began in leisure and pleasure. Famine is a function of fields that belong to someone. The rape of states' untruth that conceals the rape of individuals with telephones and the saddest jello molds. A ghost like Yeats for every decade to teach us to again walk through. We have no idea. We sit in the park and squint to see our screens while our dogs delirious pant and circle ciphers of grass. Dogs lapping up sheets of water, sustenance, a receipt for being. Leashless, unbitten dogs, dogs smelling the genitalia of other dogs. We try to take snapshots, but they blur. Dogs of relief and territory, dogs of fetch and dig, dogs of we have no idea, dogs chewing on the bones of things once living like they mean it. This next poem, for me, is about divorce. For you, it might be about other things. But I wanted to just say that it's in 3 sections, and each section uses the same set of words. So all the words in the first section are the same words in the second section, but obviously in a different order. Bindweed remembering. Necklace bindweed which glitters and cools, necklace bindweed which hoists my joints through my ribs, felons the simple custody of our remembering. How will I this hiatus? How will I this back which I cannot see without mirrors? How will you whisper when the wind has divorced itself from bluebirds? Remember my fishnets, my snapdragons, my light bulb hands, cable of hair that copses the living room. Now tomato atoms cluster in the backyard, shiver in the remorseless nuptial of where else. Children of the shorn, vaulted voices, small unfolding cabinets which erupt, which thicken, which snag. 2. Now remembering bulbs our nuptial hands, wind glitter our joints, bindweed, which fishnets tomatoes in light, snags bluebirds cluster in backyards, mirror atoms whispering hiatus. How remorseless unfolding, how divorced the snapdragons from voice. Will I remember the children, the felons, my own ribs hoisted into custody? Cable which I cannot see, which cools through a small thicket of hair. Which room of where else? Which room will you back into? Cabinets of necklaces, shiver of necklaces. How without will I simplify this? The shorn, the vaulted, I which when itself wills my hour, which in the copse has erupted, my, that the living. 3. Tomatoes without hands will the children to remember necklaces of snapdragons, necklaces of voice that bluebirds weed and bind to light, small vaulted ribs, simple joints. How I cannot shiver. We wind their custody through the copse, whisper our unfolding. Rooms erupt into living hiatus. If we cluster the nuptial in the backyard, will a felony of atoms glitter past our remembering? Bindweed the bulbs that otherwise divorce? My fishnets cool back into me, now into you. Will you hoist me, our cabinets of shorn hair? How else will we cable the room which cools, which itself thickens with remorse? How I lessen, when and where and which snag. See? This next poem is for anybody, I'm assuming a lot of the people in the room, who has ever written a cover letter or will be forced to write a cover letter and has felt it to be not the most fun process. And I should say at the beginning of this poem, at the end, there's a play on words between I am and I am the poetic foot. You can't hear it, so I'm telling you. She had no cover letter. It's just one word and then another, she told herself. Just line them up. Let them mean you. Stick to concrete details and examples. Scholarships, publications, syllabi, dust under showroom cars, awards, conferences, the piazza flooded, degrees, skills, teaching experience, memberships, lemon meringue, lemon rind, lemon juice, lemonade, sunlight spattering sidewalks, sinking into soil, draped over your head, which is drifting away on the wide raft of his chest. Damn you, lemon meringue, she thought, with your torched crests of froth, your bright bewilderment. Each day she began again. I am applying for, I graduated from, my scholarly interests include. But the words never felt like her words, were heavy as vaults in a bank-ridden, tree-troubling world. She elbowed the words as she would elbow her elbows into suits. On a good day, she'd dishevel her hair a little, look in the mirror, declare, there is nothing I can't tailor. Come on, give me a lemon tree and watch me prune it. Sometimes her words would begin to move of their own volition across the page. This made her uncomfortable. She felt that they were up to something, had plastic document covers up their sleeves. Once, she spent all day imagining herself as a template, and that evening, she thought she had one, felt the fish in her eyes calm, was pleased with her sellable summary of her strengths, with its tidy perimeters and proficient lemonless gleam. She printed it out, went to bed, but when she woke, the cover letter was seeping sap, as if from the eyes of a parking lot Virgin Mary. By lunchtime, it was just a pool of molasses on her desk. Nothing was clearly delineated. She strived to write lucid, skimmable sentences, sentences that you could look into and see her, but I am, was so close to I am, she couldn't forget it. She was, it's true, distracted. She was all additional materials upon request. When she dies, no one will know what to say because her accomplishments will be indiscernible from her failures, and the wind, she knows, will sweep the interstate clean. She imagines her mother or lover or the embalmer who can't suture her mouth shut will get up to apologize for the absence of her body, will say, I'm sorry, her mouth was full of meteors, i.e. lemons. Domestication, I guess, would be another word. Upon encountering a t-shirt that read, "Unicorns are lame, said no one ever," and disagreeing. In a world where flounder corrugate the bottom of the sea with their double-eyed sides, in a world where leopard slugs slide down a rope of mucus and male sexual organs emerge from heads to entwine and fan out into a translucent sperm-swapping flower, in a world where extremophiles live in volcanoes, blind cave spiders carry egg sacs in their mouth parts until spiderlings hatch, ducks sleep half awake, in a world where zombie fungus infects and controls the brains of ants, megabats swoop, neon mantis shrimp see colors we cannot fathom, in a world where men snort the pulp of rhino horns and women undergo surgery to globe their breasts, and fetuses are growing birdish ribs in the human dark, and we eat chickens ground down and reconstituted into shapes and dusted with flavoring. In this world, what is a horse with a horn? Shall we say our imaginations are tiny as a flag planted into the head of a broken animal? Shall we say our magic comes up white though the light of the sun blinds us stupid? Shall we trade all feral fur for this thin thermostat? Shall we try to detain the claw and snarl of forests with such a princess hoax? Shall we pretend the horse was placid, offered its horsepower of its own accord? Unicorns are a tempering, a tampering, a double taming, a virtue, a curfew. You think unicorns are innocent magic, but they be teaching your daughter shit. Before the unicorns came all pink, fog, and fame into their bedrooms, those girls were in the woods snorting like minotaurs, threads pulling every which way from their shorts. The unicorns say nothing, but your daughters hear them. Down on all fours, darling. Toss your comely mane. Whinny in the wind. Temptress the treetops with your equine body. Be the prettiest passivity. See how the virgins drape their rarity over my rarity. Soak up all your blood when no one's watching. Turn your beastly bodies into blank pages. Open your eyes so wide that glitter spills from them. Everyone will love you. Everyone will be enchanted. What magic you will actually possess is unclear. You can't fly, darling. That's the PEGASYS, smart horse. You can't eat children. That's the goblin, smart dwarf. You can't drink the blood and gather high art into your velvet dens. That's the vampire, smart undead. What do unicorns even do besides emerge and disappear, besides fill the woods with a dull shimmer? If there must be unicorns, let them gore the guts of the oglers. Let them graffiti the trees with the grievances of the mythically domesticated. Let them aerate the playgrounds into chasms. Look at their horns like masts, like phalli, like arrows driven into the skulls of deer and natives. Let them not point to the sky's tedious alibi of ascension, but bleed from their third eyes. Let them dig in the dirt with their blood horns, their cartilage scorn, their tame me once, shame on you, tame me twice, got you through. And if and when they touch our sons and daughters with their horns, let our children's small chests bloom with spikes. Thank you so much.
George McCormick writes about place as well as anyone I know writing today. The places he writes about come mostly, I think, from the places where he's been. You would certainly deduce that by reading him. He grew up in California, Southern California. He's lived in the Rocky Mountains in Montana, and now he lives in Oklahoma. So his subject is in some way the Southwest and the West. He's a recipient of the 2013 O. Henry Prize. He's also published in Arcadia. He lives in Lawton, Oklahoma, where he is an assistant professor at Cameron University. Please welcome this extraordinary writer. Thank you.
I'm going to read from the new book. The novel is narrated by a landscape photographer who in the course of the novel moves from California to Oklahoma. And the landscape photographer is sort of The subjects of his photographs are sort of loosely defined as sort of American ruins. And in this section, he has just taken a job at a community college in Oklahoma where he's teaching 6 sections of intro to photography. He then gets out of the classroom and there's an encounter. Okay, I'll just say that much. Okay. I'd been watching freight trains from the window of my 10 o'clock Tuesday-Thursday class all semester. The classroom was on the 3rd floor of a 4-story brick building, a converted dorm, located on the edge of campus, beyond which a set of railroad tracks rose from a shallow ravine on a gravel ballast. Class ended at 11 o'clock, and usually by 11:15, and never later than 11:17, an eastbound Burlington Northern Santa Fe freight train would pass. Some days I had needy or previously delinquent students that I had to deal with, but other days I'd leave my things on the lectern and go to the window and watch the trains. Often on the plains, you'll see impossibly long trains, especially strings of coal cars that will stretch out 200 and 300 cars long. But this train that passed the college was short, 20 to 30 cars, and the track that it traveled through town on wasn't the main line but a spur, which meant these cars were part of a larger string somewhere on the edge of town. The cars themselves were mixed, boxcars, flats, grain hoppers, and from my vantage point, most appeared empty. Soon I was taken by a simple question. What did they take from Lawton, Oklahoma? What did this city produce that was desired? In the next week, I became so transfixed by this question that one day I ended class early and decided to follow the train into town. I gathered my things, my slides, my lecture notes, my stack of student portfolios, and went down the stairs and out into the parking lot to my truck. At 11:18, after the train had passed, I drove out of the parking lot and over the tracks and turned left onto a kind of frontage road that ran parallel to the tracks. I followed it for a mile or so before it dead-ended, and I was forced in a series of impromptu left and right turns to follow the train by sight. When I lost it for several minutes, I cut through a neighborhood near the tracks and spied it again, the orange top of the engine, a quarter mile away, as it moved behind a windbreak of cypress. I followed it a short distance, another half mile or so before the road curved. I followed the curve through a traffic signal, past several blocks of light industry, until suddenly the concrete cylinders of a grain elevator appeared before me. It was several stories high. 2/3 of the way up the first cylinder, in fading gray paint, it read, Lawton Co-op. The road now emptied into a warehouse directly across from the elevator. I pulled into a connecting dirt road and gravel parking lot and parked on its far side. The train had come to a stop at the base of the elevator, and a moment later an alarm sounded somewhere within the complex. Next, a red light above the elevator's arm began flashing. I didn't see a single person around. From inside the elevator, I could hear a machine come to life, and a moment later, a rush of material, some kind of gray powder, came roaring from the open mouth of the arm and into the open bed of one of the grain hoppers. It took several minutes to fill the car, and when it was finished, the whole train bucked and shuddered and moved forward until the next empty car was in position. The wind suddenly picked up, and I watched as a gust gathered the elevator's loose powder and swirled it in a rising helix toward the sky. It twisted as it rose, and when it reached the top of the elevator, it framed itself against the big blue sky, moving strangely like a jellyfish or a murmuration of starlings before being pulled apart. A second plume now formed and rose similarly, and what struck me was the way in which these twisting plumes were no wider than each of the elevator's cylinders, but just as tall, so that for a moment they looked like a hologram of the building or the ghost of an ancient tower before rising and disappearing. The gusts now blew grit and garbage across the parking lot, and I got into the cab of the truck and closed the door. I got my camera out of its bag and attached a density filter, and from inside the truck I began searching for another powder cloud to photograph. I took several photographs while I waited, when, suddenly, I noticed out of the corner of the viewfinder a figure. I turned the camera on it. A boy, shirtless, with dark red skin, jogged across the parking lot toward the train tracks. I lowered my camera and watched as he approached the track's ballast. Instead of climbing up it and crossing as I expected, he followed its slope eastward, away from the train, for another 20 yards or so before stopping at the opening of a broad, round, concrete drain pipe. He crouched down and peered into it for a moment, and then just like that, disappeared. A minute later, the train sounded its horn and slowly began the process of disembarking from the co-op. It was louder leaving than it had been arriving, each car bucking, the connections locking and tugging, the wheels squalling as they began to roll. As I watched the train gain momentum and make its way around the curve, I kept one eye on the mouth of the dark hole the boy had ducked into. I took several photographs of the grain elevator, of dust rising from the train and wind, of the fading co-op sign, of the elevator's arm with just a trickle of powder now falling from it. Then, just as I was about to go, I saw the boy emerge from the pipe. He was skinnier than I'd originally noticed. He wore big, baggy shorts that came down to his shins, below which he wore high tops without socks. Whereas he had jogged before, now he walked with a soulful gait, and he seemed to be singing to himself as he went. A gust of wind rocked the truck again, and as I raised my camera and watched the boy through it, I wondered, is he impervious to this wind or just oblivious to it? After he crossed the parking lot, I broke my camera down and put it in its bag and turned my truck around and headed back to the university. A week later, on a windy, overcast day, I drove back out to the parking lot across from the co-op in hopes of shooting the train and the dust again, only in a more muted light. I had no particular image in mind that I wanted to capture, only the working notion that a different quality of light would produce different results. I had no idea what the dust or the gray powder clouds would look like without shadows, or without the depth of blue skies as before, but I was curious to see. And again the train came in around 11:20, and as it came to a noisy stop, resting just below the elevator's arm, again the alarm sounded, the red light illuminated, and the gray powder came pouring out. I set up my camera, but didn't take any pictures. Instead, I found myself waiting, hoping for the boy again. And when he arrived, again jogging, shirtless, only this time wearing a pair of jeans whose knees had been blown out, I watched as he made his way up to the ballast gravel slope and walked along it toward the drain pipe. He disappeared into its mouth, and the train disembarked shortly thereafter, sounding its horn as it went. When the train was gone, and when the boy emerged again, I was tempted to raise my camera, center him as he walked and sang, and photograph the grace he carried as he crossed the parking lot. But I did not. Instead, I watched as the tracks and the co-op and the drain pipe all returned to silence. In the coming days, I meant to return, but for one reason or another, I did not. And it wasn't until toward the end of the semester that I found myself again staring out the window of the converted dormitory after class, watching for the 11:15 and thinking about the jogging boy. Then one day, just after Thanksgiving, I drove back out to the parking lot. I waited for the boy, telling myself that now that it had grown cold, I probably wouldn't see him again. When the train pulled in and he didn't show, I got out of the truck and walked around the dirt and gravel parking lot. There was an extraordinary amount of broken glass everywhere, and I became conscious of how my boots crunched in it as I walked in widening circles from my truck. Then there was the boy, moving from my right to my left, across the parking lot, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was as if I were watching a wild animal in its element, a coyote beside a river. I stood still as he crossed. As he crossed, he paid no attention to me or the truck. He jogged with his hands close to his chest and his head down, and again he seemed to be talking or singing to himself. I watched him as he made his way across the parking lot to the ballast, then turned and headed east, away from the train, toward the pipe. Across town I could hear an ambulance. Above that was the sound of the gray powder falling in waves from the elevator's arm into the grain car, and I wondered what my part in this whole scene was exactly. I held up my camera and scanned the tracks to the east in the viewfinder. I walked across the parking lot, up the gravel to the tracks, and walked between them. When the train started up again, I stopped and listened, shot several photos, and watched as it pulled out, its cars bucking and shifting, and began to head slowly in our direction. Then, below the sound of all of this, I could hear the boy's voice emanating from the pipe. It was either singing or shouting. I couldn't tell. I walked the track in that direction, and as I neared it, I listened closely. There were words, but I could not make them out, and there seemed to be a kind of chorus that was repeated. A moment later, the train sounded its horn, and I climbed from the tracks down the ballast to the ground. Then the train was on top of us, a moving mountain, and in this sonic space, this cover, this square, I moved toward the pipe's opening. I crouched and peered in. There, About 10 feet inside was the boy, his back bent along the curve of one side of the pipe and his feet pressed against the other, his eyes closed, his lips snarling as he screamed into the sound of the train overhead, and his hands, at times clenched in fists, other times pointing violently, moved with dexterity and with rage. I was fearful that at any second he'd open his eyes and see me, but he didn't, and somehow I knew that as long as the train was overhead, he was spellbound and would sing. I tried to listen more closely, to hear the boy's song, but the echoing through the pipe blotted out all other sound. I watched the boy another 20 seconds or so, then got back to my feet and backed away from the mouth. A moment later, the last train car passed and I watched it. I took pictures as it sped away, down the track, and disappeared after the first bend. Back in my truck, I watched the boy emerge and make his way across the parking lot, heading back the way he'd come every day, every week. For how long? When the boy was gone, I got my camera and walked out into the middle of the parking lot. I took photographs of some wind-blown garbage pressed against a fence. I took some of the grain elevator, the tracks, the dark, awful mouth of the drain pipe itself. I knew these photographs would never mean anything to anybody but me or him, though the idea of the boy ever seeing them would always, of course, be impossible.
Cori A. Winrock's extraordinary debut collection, This Coalition of Bones, was a finalist for the Walt Whitman Award and was published by Cori Press in April 2014. Her work has appeared in Best New Poets 2013 and 2011, Black Warrior Review, Colorado Review, Denver Quarterly, From the Fish House, The Journal, Crazy Horse, West Branch, and elsewhere. And she currently is a Vice Presidential Fellow, that sounds very grand, in the Creative Writing PhD program at University of Utah. Cori A. Winrock.
So this first poem I'm going to read is based off a photograph by Zoe Leonard, and that is the title of the poem. And it opens with an epigraph by Emily Dickinson. I tried to match it seam by seam, but could not make it fit. Anatomical model of a woman's head crying. Not split like an atom or a house, a city by its waterways, sliced again by the suggestive steel and girdered arc of low bridges. Not opened as in cracked or as in destined to be halved, fast as an egg on an edge, the easy division. You are cleaved clean as a wax wedding cake, Our Lady of Griefs of the half-exposed hemispheres, stuck in the incision of your splitting. Indisposed, you are vivid sections of a mind corseted in tight, raveled folds. Your moth lips, too halved to kiss or speak. In the gap of them, a gasp. The scientific model maker was head over you. His replica, a study of. His desire, a mold of accuracy and abandon. Abandon the house, abandon the body. To cut was to cast you in half. To make you cry was to cast you as saint. No rooms were left for despairing in. How you would not come closer to godliness. With luck, somewhere your real skull, a self-seamed, sound, matched whole, your thoughts grown daring in their consensual togetherness. When I was a student here and working on this manuscript, it was getting pretty heavy. So Lyra told me I needed to write in air pockets, and also that I needed to get over my problem with sonnets. So I ended up writing a whole series, which is much of the third section of the book, of these poems called the Suburban Sonnets. And this is the sixth one. How the curtains curtain us. In the blackout to hail a bus or tram, shine a torch onto your hand. Our towns grow aerial in their feathered darks. No living room lights allowed to fasten these houses to their yards. If the curb birches unfetter their stark whites, we douse the ghost bark black, blow out their limb before dinner. We are not moored by our kitchens, our basements, our small gathering of rooms.
Make us strangers, we beg to the backs of our windows when we are sure we no longer live there. Make us. We lull yard after yard of fabric until each set of panes is tight dressed, drop our feelings as loose night in the folds. When we are ready to wave ourselves away from our empty households, we press the light to our palms and raise them, glove bright and floating like thrushes before our imperceptible faces. We struggle not to be pulled in by the rush of our own disembodied glow, not to leave any traces. A lot of what makes being in the MFA program so fantastic is the cohort, and a lot of these poems sort of come out of that interaction with them. And this is an example. I had a friend, Christopher, who was really into pro wrestling, and he wanted us to come watch it, and we were like, no. And then we finally went, and it was sort of fabulous. You know, pro wrestling is like this choreographed violence and sort of ridiculousness together. And I got really into the vocabulary of it, and Christopher and I challenged each other to each write a lyric poem that used the most number of wrestling terms possible, because it seemed like a total clash of the worlds. Wrestlers in winter. Barbed wire in a landscape of slow muscles, snow gauze bloomed through with veins. Not a hibernation, an undarking devoir, these turnbuckled grounds, this heart sleep in blue. Entrance music a tender cuff, sluggish score of unthawing punches, forget-me-not, phlox, digitalis blue season of stop motion and iced over shiners. Ring around the rosy, bladed, now bled, blue. If the frozen bell of these bodies begs to be unclappered, if rest hold, if head drop, if near fatal fall, snow coat the squared circle, drape its apron to blur, fluoresce, cup your mouth to say concuss, contusion, kiss, until they turn. This piece is from the second section of the book, which deals a lot with neurology and memory, and it's called Bias 1, Singular Orphic Selves, and it has an epigraph from George Orwell's 1984. Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. 1. Momentary sensation of a remembered whole. 2 months after you died, your letters kept arriving. Hello? 2. A finite set of surviving neurochemical coordinates. X, 0, 1. My love, you are inaccessible. 3. Memories are actually memories of memory. Here they are twinned in opulence, fuzziness, washed in architecture. 4. Here the temporary constellation of memory. Y, -1, 0, your heart, the right half of a split brain patient. The entire atmosphere of our mind lighting up chemically. Flickering electrical. Picture the lightning storm above the kitchen sink as the halogen bulb switches on. 5. We were searching, but there was no way to pinpoint the first lost memory. We were inside unfilled consciousness, pellucid, dreaming. 6. Z, -1, 1. Who we were, amendments of the way we are now. Situations were devised, each hemisphere of us digested without awareness of what the other was experiencing. 7. That last night we were wave touching, our brain making our hands heavy with sleep. The magnets were left too close to our temples, erased us entirely. Old snow, a white blowing into the folds, this fern, our winter mind. And I thought I would read a couple new pieces as well. The title of this piece is the title of the current manuscript that I'm working on, Debridement, and it means to remove damaged tissue from a wound. When I find out I'm pregnant, I bury my wedding dress in the front yard, letting everyone in the neighborhood watch me peel the blue satin over my head, my slipless figure and a shovel. The school bus slowing its yellow dredge to witness the anxiety of the uncovered. I dig a tunnel to my grandmother straight through my mother. Her old flower bulbs empty rattles, their bodies now fists in earth. I lick my ungloved hands and gather fragments of bone and leftover teeth into my mouth. How else to feed the matryoshka body its double hummingbird hearts. Ashes, ashes. In the tunnel, I uncover a nightgown I sloughed off as I lost my virginity to a song about 11s, crawl back into its florals and incorporeal sense of expectation. The assistant's glittering self sawed open to applause. Down here, my new cluster of cells can't echo or mirror. It lullabies me with replication, tells me to revisit the rooms I flooded just to peel off the wallpaper, to uproot the ugly azaleas from the family before and before. When I arrive at my childhood, I undress the house like a wound. The thing for me that's interesting about this is that the images from Ithaca ended up in a poem that's nothing about Ithaca, and the way that Ithaca sort of gets into you that way. Law of diminishing returns. In a copse, the deer's body is glass-felled, is still beating cross-sections, is abrupt-bladed. The deer's body is my body, and we are not waiting for each other in some teenage kind of way. What I wish I were saying. Eurydice follows her mother instead of her lover. I am tired of glances as apologia. My ribcage and trussings are heavy-hemmed with sludging through snow. 2 white deer that were not ghosts when we saw them in the Army Depot in upstate against an apocalyptic sunset, splitting a landscape into 2 perfect halves of light and no light. They were real. And I am halved again. My sudden sight, my mouth open enough to sing into. Don't tell me she slipped away or between, that the dough I am has already been sliced. A slip is a minor mistake, a made haste, as in her gorgeous slip of the tongue spoiled the surprise. A tongue does not always want its wanting. I love you. I love you. I know you. I know you will not return or the same. I lullaby the seasons. And I thought I would end on a piece that's brand new that I just had workshopped, because I also feel like that's part of being an alum, as a reminder that we're still always just writing and just creating everything. Aubad for future resurrection. I arbor glyph our initials into the trees, and the little white dress in my heart says, bang, bang, lays herself down like a crime scene. I imagine this is how it feels when the small church of birds in your hands refuses to lift its hem of song. Never mind the pins and needles attending my body as if felled. Never mind the aspen psalms, the burls, their zillion unblinking eyes. Your perfume brays off until I am sugarless under the sheer force of unfloral light. Light so pre-winter low it splits the wood to shadow, splits the wood back to salt. Even for those of us who kept such vigil moons, no arrival, no avowal. The forest refuses to laurel its leaves around our chalk outlines. And I'm not drunk enough to admit this must feel like when God stops talking to even the most devoured in faith. Darling, let me pin me open before you begin the autopsy. Our morning fog voices coming through my coat as so many hand-embroidered girls. Thank you.